He's written a book called Swords into Plowshares, A Life in Wartime and a Future of Peace and Prosperity, drawing on the old verse from Isaiah 2:4. And he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. It's also a reference in Joel and Micah, but I digress. Former Congressman Ron Paul is our guest. Congressman?
Good to be with you, Michael.
Glad to have you with us. I'm going to get right to it because I always enjoy our conversations. The Iran nuke deal. You have come out seeming to support it. I think people that know you well are not surprised by that, but why?
All right. Well, I think it's a move in the right direction. You know, it's messy, but the current conditions are very messy. And I've argued on the stage, and everything I've ever done is that we ought to talk to people rather than just threaten people. And one of the best examples of that was in my lifetime when I was drafted into the military during the Cuban crisis, and I was delighted that Kennedy decided to talk to Khrushchev, you know, and he was, we had a vicious enemy there. The Soviets had 30,000 nuclear weapons, and still they talked to each other, and the missiles were taken out of Cuba, and quietly we took missiles out of Turkey. So I would say that's a good example of what we ought to be doing, because people use the argument, oh, you can't talk to them, these are bad people. Well, we don't have to sit down and pester the Canadians about a debate like this, because we're not anticipating that we're going to have a war with Canada. But I think if people are potentially our enemies, we ought to talk. And I think Nixon did the right thing by opening up the doors for China. And they were a bunch of bad people, and they still do have some bad ideas. But we trade with them now, and I believe strongly in what the founder said, that you know, if you have peace and commerce and honest friendship, you're less likely to fight and kill each other. And right now, we're less likely to fight and kill the Chinese, as we were doing when I was in high school.
But Ron Paul, you've never been a man that struck me as naive. You understand the if not the realpolitik of Henry Kissinger. You understand people's motivations. I mean, we're dealing with a rogue regime of people that I find it hard to believe that this deal has to be based on some degree of trust when you get into monitoring and inspections. And I can't ever get around to trusting them.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether they fully trust us either. But I think there's a distortion of the facts. For instance, we have learned and been conditioned to distrust and hate the Persians, and that they're going to kill us, just like we were conditioned. Just look at the conditioning that we had for Saddam Hussein, who used to be an ally, and we gave him his first nuclear reactor. So there is a lot of that goes on. But there's no history, to show that Iran are aggressive people. When's the last time they invaded a country? Over 200 years ago. So they're not, and we're the ones that are all around the world, and yet everybody, won't pay much attention to that.
But in fairness, Congressman Paul, they are a regime that has been arming and preparing and guiding insurgents in multiple incursions, Iraq, Afghanistan. These are not guys that are isolationists. They're sending their folks out into the world to fight us.
Yeah, but have you ever looked at the map of what they've been surrounded with? They're surrounded with nukes and people who have taken over $100 billion of their money and said, we're going to put sanctions on you. So if you compare to what you're saying to what our CIA does, how many places have we been? And can you go back and, look at the history of how this whole thing started? It was started in 1953. I was still in high school then, and that's when there was an elected leader of Iran, and they were annoyed because the British and the Americans were taking their oil, and so they elected this leader. But because of this oil fight, we had a coup. We threw most Mossadegh out, and we installed the Shah. The Shah was a murdering dictator. He was the incentive for the radicalization of the mullahs, who finally, got their point across in 1979. But to see this as an isolated incident, I think is not the right way to go. And if you compare what they're doing and their involvement, I would say ours is probably 99% of the interventions around the world. We're in 160 countries, and Iran, is involved with Hezbollah and the others trying to protect their interests. But I still think that if we can talk to the Soviets, and I think we have to be aware that that there's going to be a problem. But Reagan did another deal with the Soviets at the height. And they had 30,000 missiles. And if the Republicans had done what Obama just did, the Republicans would, okay. They didn't say boo about Reagan doing it. And yet that was even a bigger gamble. But it was the right gamble to make.
A minute and a half left in this segment. Ron Paul is our guest. The book is Swords into Plowshares. Terrorist attack on American soil today by a Muslim in Chattanooga, killing 4, wounding 2 more, and he ends up dead. I don't know that we can stop these random attacks, but what should be our response?
Investigate and find out what's going on, and make sure we have the facts before we drop a bomb on somebody. We don't know the details. A lot of times, the immediate reaction isn't exactly what really happened. So I don't know in details, but this is. If you're going to have a purpose for government, it should be for preserving the peace. So the person that does this, gets a penalty. But I don't think this is an excuse to declare war on some country. It should be an excuse to look at our own selves and find out why there are a lot of people who would like to kill us right now. And that's what people can't do. They can't think that we have anything to do with it. But we talk about terrorism. But if you were in a Muslim family at a funeral and a bomb came out of the sky with a drone, and an innocent wedding party or a funeral party killed a bunch of people, wouldn't you call that terrorism? I mean, and we've done this. It is estimated that at the hands of United States policy during the 1990s, 500,000 Iraqis were killed. And Madeleine Albright admitted this. She said, well, that's just the price you have to pay for our policy. And we have to understand that if we ever want to have peace in the world. And we just don't need to go looking for another fight. We need a peace dividend. We need plowshares.
It is a practical reality that your son is running for president. And we just aired our interview I did with him earlier today before yours. The timing just happened to work out that way. And as I made clear there, he is his own man. And I don't expect him to account for your views or you to account for his, because my wife gets to have her own opinions and he gets to have his own. And whether you are a positive or a negative to him, it will be decided by the voters. But there is a challenge when a president, when a former presidential candidate, an outspoken man as yourself, has a son who's running and he has to bear that yoke. Do you think he is unfairly judged by those who may have disagreed with you?
Well, I don't know whether the word is fair or unfair, but it's a reality that it's complex, and like you say, nobody's going to know until they see what the votes do, what happens in the voting. But it's difficult for me because I've been involved in this back since 1974 in speaking out on the issues, and I've continued to do this, and I worry a whole lot because we will have some places where we explain things differently. But I just don't think you could say, well, he has a different position on foreign policy, and they look at me and then they say that's going to hurt. But what about his position on civil liberties and the drug war and some of the things going on now? He's the only one that's talking about that. So he's had some benefits as well. So it's a mixed bag. But I think the most important statement is we are each our individual selves, and almost all of us have some disagreements at time on issues with our wives, and nobody makes a big deal of it. But and every election's a little bit different. This one is certainly different than anything I was involved in when you have 16 candidates. So it's getting to be sort of a little bit confusing.
Ron Paul is our guest. The book is Swords into Plowshares. When you look at the changes in Washington and Colorado, you're a guy that's long argued, and I think reasonably and correctly, that our war on drugs is a failure. Mm-hmm. And you see states flouting federal law, while I like the positive that, look, you're showing that people can smoke pot without murdering people to get it. But the flip side is that's something of a sanctuary city policy, isn't it?
Well, I don't know whether I'd use the word flouting, because originally, if we listened to Jefferson, it was such a thing called nullification, and that was supposed to be an established principle, and then we left it. So when the state passes a law, I think it's a form of nullification, and I wish we would do a lot more of it. Yeah, I think local, even though the sanctuary city may be a very negative thing for somebody, I think that in a true republic, San Francisco can make their own mistakes, and they have to clean up their mess just so we don't have to pay for that. But I think that the more the government is local, the better. And sometimes the local people don't do so well. But the drug war is a good example of what happens with when the states finally say, because we have so many examples medically how people can be helped with marijuana, but the principle isn't drugs. The principle is who should make the decisions for us about taking a risk. And I just say it's not the government, because then they become the nanny state, and then they protect us against ourselves, and then they have political correctness, and and then there's economic intervention, then we apply this to foreign affairs. It's completely opposite of what a free society is all about, where people are allowed to do what they want. They must do. One basic rule is you can't hurt other people. You can't steal, rob, and defraud people. And but people should assume this responsibility. If they can do what they want, and the government's not to take care of them, they have to assume this responsibility. So if drugs are legal and somebody does something to themselves, they can't come crying. I remember in one debate when they pressed me on this, in I think it was South Carolina, because they stated my position a little more radically than I ever would, but say, you would let the kids have heroin, So instead of trying to argue with them, because in my 30 seconds, I says, okay, how many people in this audience, if heroin was legalized tomorrow, how many of you would use it? Of course, none of them would. So it's who has the responsibility and who makes the decisions about taking risk. And if you say it's the government, then you have to have seat belts and airbags that sometimes kill us, and on and on. This whole idea that government can take care of is just a total fallacy. This is what the welfare state is based on. They're going to take care of us, and they've created a monster. They've destroyed the middle class. But that same principle is what happens when we get involved overseas. We say, well, Syria is in bad trouble, and Assad's a bad guy. And here we've been fighting for 3 years trying to get rid of this guy. By what moral right do we have to assume that we should go get rid of Assad and then yell and scream if the Iranians want to help preserve Assad in that capacity? I think we should be neutral, and that's what was advised to us. And I think under those conditions, we're more likely to get a peace dividend. In my lifetime, we had a great peace dividend after World War II. We got nothing when the Soviet system collapsed because we saw no competition, and we decided it's the American empire, we're taking over, and that is it. So we spend more money than ever. We spend more money on military than the top 15 countries around the world on military. And then we build up fear that the Iranians are coming. This is a third world nation. They have no air force, no navy, nothing, no missiles, and yet people are intimidated to say, well, we got to threaten them. If they don't come clean, we're going to drop a bomb on them. I think it's all war propaganda, and it's driven too often by the military-industrial complex.
Ron Paul is our guest. I've got a minute and a half left. I'm going to let you take us to the break. You'll hear the music cue us out. You've run for president multiple times. You were often running against a candidate named Bush or at least a Republican establishment led by many folks that were close to that family. And now the release yesterday by Jeb Bush of $103 million in a super PAC, and you see it all over again. Can you finish our segment for the last minute and a half talking about the Republican establishment and their lock on the primary process and the foreign policy they all seem to be lockstep with?
Yeah, they're all the same, but I see the Democrats the same way. You know, the Democrats are supposed to be the champion of the poor, but they get their money from Wall Street, too. Money is a big problem, but it's secondary. It's a symptom of what the problem is. Money is spent on the politicians, both in elections and in lobbying, because governments have so much to offer. If you had a government that was designed only to protect individual liberty, there would be no incentive for the military-industrial complex and the media complex, everybody else, the medical complex now, and the insurance complex, to spend so much money. So you have to get rid of the power from the government. And that fits into my theory in my book. Take away the power of our government officials to start a war. That's what our founders tried to do with our Constitution, made it very difficult. The president can't start a war. The king did that, and we didn't like it. So they tried to get it back to the people. Now, today, Republican or Democrat, they just start them. And they don't, they have preemptive war by our Republican president. I think that's
Ron Paul, I'm up against a break. I wish I wasn't. The book is Swords into Plowshares.